Leader of Opposition to open up the closing opposition. Sorry, I just saw the message pop up, sorry. I thank that member for their speech and I invite the Leader of Opposition to open up the op bench. Hear, hear.
And just really quickly, sorry, I totally forgot to record that first speech, but I started the recording now. That's my bad.
Awesome. Okay. All right, starting now. So I think the notion that you're going to destroy the entire capitalist system by removing this narrative, I think, is fraught at best. I think that what I'm going to do in this speech is, first, I'm going to de-link the majority of their case. I'm going to tell you why it is actually not going to be undermining capitalism, that these links are tenuous at best, and then I'm going to go into points of construction, going to tell you why actually this narrative results in more equity in the workplace, two, why it creates happiness. I'm going to talk also about the true counterfactual that needs to be addressed in this round, and then the spillover effects of this narrative. So first, on this notion that you're going to uphold capitalism. So I'm going to actually go and look at their links here. So they tell you that it's going to result in fracturing in the workplace insofar as the narrative promotes competition between people. I think that this is this is representative of a symptomatic issue with their case, which is there's a false equivalency between the amount of money that you gain and the amount of success you have in a particular field. Nowhere are we defining success as monetary. I think that this also cuts across some of their argumentation about devaluing certain kinds of labor. I think that the actual great thing about this type of narrative is that you get to choose what kind of work you're performing. I think that insofar as success is something that's internally measured, that is, I get to choose my career field. I get to choose what kind of labor I'm putting value on. Therefore, I think that actually a lot of these things that you're going to be, you're going to actually be gaining a lot more happiness when you're, yeah, I think that that's sufficiently clear here. So also on this point of unionization, I think that it is just going to be the case that when you value hard work and when you value success, you're actually going to be more class conscious on the comparative, insofar as you understand that that the worker, that you're all in a similar position with regards to your level of success. I think that if you're able to convince people that unionizing or something of that nature is in their best interest in terms of what's going to bring them career success, which we think is probably true. And I think that when you tell people that things like wealth redistribution, or when you tell people that, that having high levels of class consciousness are things that are going to be beneficial to you as an individual, I think that those are the narratives that you need to perpetuate. And I don't think that that's mutually exclusive with the narrative that success is something that is valuable. I think, in fact, if you value success, you're more likely to try and obtain it through things like unionization. So with that all being said, moving on to our case, I think that the first point is just that we're going to get more equitable workplaces. Why? I think that there's more of an incentive to improve corporate and career structures when people broadly understand that career success is something good and valuable. That is, if you value something objectively, or think that something is an objective good, and you also view other people as human beings equally, deserving of obtaining value in their lives, then of course you're going to see that, or you're going to want to implement policies that give everybody equal shots at that sort of, success in career. I think that when you view it, on the other hand, as something that's just kind of nice to have, it becomes exclusive to the people that already in the status quo have natural abilities based on birth or socioeconomic status or something like that to obtain success in a corporate or career setting. I'll take you later if I have time. Yeah, actually, CG, what's up?
Yeah, so do you think that the current narrative doesn't equivocate money and success? So for example, look at Forbes magazine, Time magazine. Do you think that fracturing still, how can you ignore that monetary value isn't ascribed with success in the status quo?
I think I got you. So I'm not going to deny that in some cases people do equate monetary success, but I think that you need to be talking about what the motion says, right? If you're a person who thinks that money equals success, then that's fine, good for you, and you can obtain that, awesome. But I think that it doesn't preclude, the point is not that there isn't sometimes an equivocation. The point is that it's not mutually exclusive. And our narrative creates solvency in the future for people who want to value other kinds of labor. Okay, So I think that, yeah, when, like, insofar as, like, currently we do live under a broad capitalist system, and I don't think they do sufficient work to prove to you why the communist revolution is coming when you remove this narrative. Insofar as people still need to live under this structure, I think that decreasing or making barriers to, like, getting work more equitable is always going to be preferable insofar as people have, need access to, like, food, they need access to housing, et cetera, et cetera. And so we'd rather the barriers to working be decreased in the status quo in the short term so that you can, like, have access to, like, actual basic needs insofar as we live under a capitalist system. So second point is just that, like, we get broad happiness on our side of the house. Like, look, like, don't take stuff away from people that makes them happy is the point here. This is not the only avenue for happiness, recognize. I think that they need to prove why it's a uniquely destructive form narrative if they want to actually win here. Recognize that, like, you can value other things. We think that you should just also be able to value the career achievement. We think that it gives you a sense of purpose in life. I think this is incredibly important. I think it gives you a distraction if other places of your life are going poorly. I think that also you have greater control over your job and your career than a lot of other things. Recognize that counterfactual forms, and the actual counterfactual that side government needs to deal with in this round, are always going to be worse. What happens when you remove the ability to measure your success based on your career? I think that it falls to, like, measuring success in terms of things like romantic pursuits or interpersonal relationship pursuits. We think that these things are on the comparative always going to be more inequitable than your actual ability to, like, have career success, particularly given that, like, romance is, like, uniquely based on things like our appearance that's you know, an arbitrary factor, what you look like. I think that the general vibe of somebody, whether or not you want to form an interpersonal relationship with them, is normally full of, like, implicit biases. I think these are always going to be less equitable. I think that further, the external-internal divide that I gave you at the top is super important here. That, like, look, insofar as you get to choose your career path, you get to choose what you are most likely to be successful in, you get a lot of control over whether or not you're going to be able to find fulfillment. We think that on the comparative, when you look at there are other, like, external sources, we think that's always going to be comparatively worse. 3, though, we think that this is going to just, like, lead to, like, good spillover effects to other society. Why? I think briefly, we think that people are broadly motivated by desires to be happy, and therefore, like, are gonna, like, in our world, like, work harder at their jobs. We think that a lot of times these jobs are something that, like, have a lot of, like, positive third party externalities. People like doctors, lawyers, teachers, these sorts of things are going to work harder, and they're going to create, like, overall a preferable society. For these reasons, proud to oppose.
I thank that member for their remarks, and I invite the Deputy Prime Minister to close off opening government. Here.
Okay, hello. I'm assuming everyone can hear me all right. I prefer POIs to be in the chat, please, and I'll keep it monitored. Opening opposition wants to tell you that by telling people they need to focus on their career, that their career makes who they are, and that they must work hard at their job in order to be successful, that we will get a more equitable society. I think this is extremely idealistic and not at all consistent with what we've seen when this narrative is implemented in society right now. I'm going to briefly refute everything we've heard from the leader of the opposition and then move into my own contention about inequalities within career and life. So in response to the constructive we've forwarded so far, we get 2 main pushbacks. The first is that success is actually internal and you can't measure it just through wealth. There's a few problems here. First, success isn't fully internally decided, and to a large extent this is conceded later on in the speech. But we think that it goes a lot farther than what they suggested, because we think that the majority of people begin to equate their success with wealth. This is because externally, when we consider what it is that makes someone successful in their career, we think about salary raises, we think about employer awards, we think about promotion. And this is reflected in the language that we use when we talk about jobs. This is why some people, we say, get stuck in quote unquote deadbeat jobs. We don't think they can just dismiss that notion. The second thing to note then is that even if people are somewhat subjective, the majority of people are still going to default to these external perceptions of success, because that is what you need to have in order to be declared within society and between your social relations as having a quote unquote successful a career. A third thing to note is that values occur in relation. So later on in the speech, they claim that, we can actually look at all of these other things that make people happy and they can have both. We don't think this is necessarily true, because whenever we value something a lot more than we value things like maybe our social lives or our family lives, which we think is true for the majority of people who are told they need to focus on their career, that they need to network in order to be successful, that they stop valuing all of those other things. And I'll get into why that's so harmful later. Last thing to note is that their own solutions, such as unions, are extremely limited in solving the problems that we've outlined. The second response we get is that people can actually choose their careers and therefore they can find happiness that way. But I'd like to note that that's not a privilege that a lot of people have. Most people feel, for example, that being an entrepreneur is better than working in a factory. But if you don't get to go to business school, if your family doesn't happen to be in a place that has a good business scene, that doesn't get to happen for you. You don't necessarily just get to choose, quote unquote, your perfect career. This is extremely idealistic and insulting to all the people who don't get that choice. Moving on to the three main claims we get in their case. The first is that we get more equitable workplaces because there's an incentive to make sure that people are successful in work. The problem is this assumes that all individuals want other individuals to succeed, but this isn't the case because career and workplace success is often a zero-sum game. That is to say, you can only get a promotion and a salary raise if some other worker sitting in the office desk next to you doesn't get that raise and stays in that job. This is extremely important because it shows that we don't necessarily have the incentive to make the workplace better for others. We only have the incentive to try and improve workplace conditions for ourselves. And far too often, the people who get to decide what workplace conditions look like are the very same people who oppress the minorities and the disadvantaged people that we outline in our case. The impact of this, however, is actually quite weird. They claim that people are going to work harder as a result, and there's this vague assertion about externalities that make people happy. I'd just like to note this is not within the scope of the debate. We clearly outlined that, sure, there are things that you can get from work, such as material wealth and maybe happiness, that are valuable, but our point here is to say that being successful in your career isn't something I should value as a means, as the end, and it isn't something that I should use to define my identity. The second claim we get from them is that work makes people happy and we shouldn't take away their happiness because there's nothing wrong with deriving pleasure from work. So first, as I've already outlined, we value other forms of happiness in relation to any happiness we might derive from work, and we think that the happiness we derive from work is uniquely more harmful. This is because oftentimes employers and people who control the means of production tell us that in order to be happy at work, we must devote all of our time to work. And this is shown through things like hustle culture and people that glorify CEOs who literally devote their entire lives to their business, to their work. As a result, people begin to ignore their family, their social life, and their relationships. In response to this, we hear, oh, but these other forms of happiness are far more arbitrary, and giving the example of vibes in romance. But we think this is entirely symmetric because whether or not you get hired and whether or not you get promoted depends on whether or not that employer gets quote unquote good vibes from you. The difference, however, is that when it comes to romantic relationships, the diversity of people you can pick from is far greater, whereas the types of people who show up in hiring circles tend to be exactly the same. They tend to look like the same types of interviewers looking for the same types of corporate values. With that said, let's move on to a third contention within inequalities within career and life. I'd like to point out that a hierarchy of careers exists when certain types of jobs are materially and socially valued to a greater extent. This is why, for instance, we glorify CEOs and management positions, but we ignore factory workers, sanitation workers, and secretaries. Why is this the case? Two main things. First, because career achievements and success are seen in very individualistic ways, insofar as the types of awards we get are ones that we give to individual people or even teams at most. This is to say, we value the work every individual says they put out, so for example, the number of hours they put in at work, rather than the work that the company on whole does for society or whatever job it happens to be. Second thing is that some jobs are seen as more valuable because they allow you to control and exploit others. So for instance, we tend to value leadership and management positions far more. This has three main harms. First, we think this devalues collective work, and it hinders the efficacy of companies to have when they have competing teams within their firm. The reason this is the case is because it means that every individual feels that to get ahead, they must put in more hours or more work than the person sitting right beside them, and as a result, they are less able to work as a team. Second harm is that it ruins the self-esteem of the poor who essentially are told they're useless labor. This is especially true for minorities and disabled people who don't advance for a lot of reasons unrelated to their performance at work, and that was something the opposition didn't contend with. The third harm is that, however, is that when success becomes measured in hours worked in hopes of climbing the ladder, so for instance, glorifying CEOs who work from 5 a.m. to midnight on projects, then hustle culture that encourages people to put all of their energy into work, to wake up and feel excited about going to work, is that people become workaholics, insofar as trying to derive happiness from work prevents them from accessing happiness in any other part of their life, because they feel that going to a social event or spending time with their family is wasting time when they could instead be making money and being valuable to their capitalist overlords. This looks like people who go to work even when they're sick, which is obviously a no-go now, people who check their emails 100 times a day, and on the extreme end, Japanese workers who commit suicide because of overwork. We were never willing to support that, and we were never willing to support the exploitation of workers globally when there is such a better solution out there, and it's for that reason that we're so proud to propose the motion.
I thank that member for their remarks, and I invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition to close off the top half of today's debate. Hear, hear.
Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Give me 1 second. Just setting up a timer. I think it's important to recognize that there's not a singular profession, right? So whenever they talk about any kind of career success, they always frame it around this idea of a CEO of some like financial company being successful. That is not the only metric for success, because that's not the only career that exists, i.e. people are lawyers, people are doctors, people are teachers. So their career success probably looks like their case records for people that might have filed harassment suits being better. It might look like their patient records in terms of people that live or don't live being better. It might look like better grades being the value that they use in terms of their career success, because that is how they like access things like promotion within their own fields. Why is this important? Because of what Lydia tells you at the bottom of her speech, that these kinds of, or this value assigned to this intrinsic work, or this like intrinsic career success naturally means that you are going to have positive spillover effects, in your own life, but secondarily in terms of other kinds of areas that you affect. So maybe society at large, but also people that are in the future generations that are going to go into these fields. More on that later, but first doing some extraneous work on OG, right? So first they tell you that you are like not like, you're basically always going to be competing with other people, and like that's really bad, and capitalism sucks, and we're going to solve it by like telling people that they don't need this narrative anymore. Here's the problem: regardless of a world where the narrative of intrinsic value to career success exists or does not exist, those careers are going to exist, and capitalism is still going to exist because of the incentive structures of things like corporations that they talk about. They're always going to want you to think that you are going to be like doing certain kinds of jobs that are beneficial to them, right? Insofar as that is true, we think a narrative that doesn't mean that you yourself as an individual that is working in those firms are able to assign value to what you think is your career success, or what you think is an active accomplishment or an active achievement in that field. I think you are taking away power that you as an individual have in that like larger structure. What I mean by this is that, yes, there are people at the top of the structures that are in the leadership mechanisms of a lot of these roles, but that's not the majority of people. Why is this important? Because the majority of people are actually going to be on the lower stratas of those same corporations. So what they're trying to then achieve is trying to make sure that they are able to also access the same kind of social mobility. Why is this true? Because they assign intrinsic value to their work and to their career success. So if they can't access career success because there is a glass ceiling in terms of where they can and cannot go further, or like further up in terms of improvements of their career, then they're going to try to fix that. That's what's happening in the status quo. That's like everything that Lydia told you that went unresponded to in terms of how unions currently function, i.e. people want improvements in their workforces, so they're going to fight to make sure that those improvements are easier to access. This is why emotional labor, unlike their characterization, is actually getting assigned more like value in today's day. This is why you're fighting for things like the gender pay gap, because you realize that careers are valuable in and of themselves, and if people want to achieve those kinds of successes, and not just 5% of your population, but everybody, then you fight to make those systems better. At the lower level, these systems look like educational institutions. You try and are currently trying to make this a more equitable stream, right? Because there's a set criteria through which you are or are not able to access happiness in our world, i.e. when you get into these kinds of institutions, when you are given scholarships, regardless of where you fall on the strata, when you go into public schools that like you don't need to pay for, that where you have these kinds of governmental structures that are sure that you can succeed in this world, we think that means that you are able to better fight for the kinds of structures that are valuable for more like a larger majority of society. I'll take the POI later. But I think furthermore on that, the way that we kind of characterize this is that happiness is going to be important because that is the guaranteed emotion that we get on our side of the house that they're never able to access. And here's why: because they never actually engage with the replacement narrative, i.e. when you take this narrative away, it's not like there's going to be a vacuum and people are just going to stop feeling things. There's going to be some other narrative that takes like its place, right? This narrative is always going to be harmful because it's going to say, look, your value needs to come from other things. It doesn't need to come from career, and you need to be able to dedicate more time to your relationships because that's what's important, right? I think that then means that the social hierarchies that are a lot more pervasive in society and are literally everywhere, and that you can't get any kind of distraction from and can't get any kind of escape from, are going to be what dictate whether or not you have any kind of metric of happiness, right? I think we like don't, because they can't take the larger like capitalist structure away from you, because they can't take the larger abusive structures away from you. The way that we access happiness is actually going to be better because their world is uniquely destructive as it's dependent A on other people, but B affords you a lot less control. Cool. Actually, I'll take the PI before I move on.
Yeah, so a lot of the inequities that you say this narrative fights against, like this narrative created those inequities in the first place. Like there wouldn't be a glass ceiling that devalues women in the workplace if we didn't like value certain kinds of work and achievement, and men wanted to provide like individual benefits to themselves in the first place.
Here's the thing. This is really weird because it's not like careers in NGOs don't exist. It's not like charity work that is like an actual job, an actual career and fulfillment that you get from that career and achievements from that career don't exist, right? I think this is the place where OG actually drops out of the round because they don't engage with careers being more than just a like CEO sitting in some office at a financial institution. It's more than that. There are people that work in NGOs and their career value is probably going to be significantly higher, and like you probably have more people going into these fields because you have them valuing their career in and of themselves and the fact that they can get some kind of like positive impact coming from that career, right? They tell you that values occur in relation, and so now that you are assigning more value onto like this kind of narrative, you're taking away from other kinds of narrative, right? The problem is this is a really strange way to talk about people. Like I don't assign 5 joules to relationships and 3 joules to work, and that's how I think about how much value I'm assigning to one thing over the other, right? They probably exist in some kind of like mutual form, which means that if you are able to access happiness in this mechanism, them opposing this narrative just means that you are shutting out more people from it. But I think workplace conditions improve on our side because we strive for more improvement on those mechanisms. They tell you that hierarchy of career is going to be a problem and there exists a hierarchy of career. I think we make it significantly more fluid. I think we make it so that people are able to access areas of their career that they otherwise aren't. Doing some extension, I think on the motivation of hard work, which has positive spillover, I think to other parts of your life, right? Like your wife and kids are more likely to be happier and do better in a world where you have career achievements. And I think that's linked to you like being able to buy into this narrative. But secondly, the idea is just that society in terms of benefits stem from your profession, right? So doctors being more motivated to have positive outcomes in their cases because of their contributions to their work are valuable to them means that patients benefit from that and society benefits from that because they probably are able to do things like find more cures in the future. I think the last layer of this is future generations of individuals that are working in these professions, right? So you as a teacher are trying to teach somebody, incredibly proud to oppose.
I thank that member for their remarks, and I invite the member of government to open up the back half of today's debate. Hear, hear.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes, you're audible.
And I'll be timing myself. You can leave your POIs in the chat. I'll be monitoring it. Starting time now. Our burden on signed government was never to break down capitalism, right? This is a very theoretical debate about narratives. I think it's extremely unfair of side opposition to tell us that we don't reach any of our impacts because we can't dismantle capitalism. Let's be real, that's too big of a topic for one debate. Having said that, we think that the problem with opposition is that they think that people have this individual autonomy to choose what they want to ascribe value to. We tell you that that's what happens under our side of the house. Because what happens when you dismantle this narrative of arbitrary value ascribing? What does the counterfactual we propose looks to you like? It looks like when you get fired, you don't go into some deep delves of depression and think that because your self-worth is so low, that's why you got fired. Two, it looks like if you don't get that promotion, you don't automatically think that all your hard labor was meaningless. Three, if you work less paying jobs that society tells you are not as successful, are not as big of achievements, or if you're, for example, you're working a working class job, maybe a garbage disposal, and society under this narrative deems it as a third class working position job, we tell you that under our world, we're not measuring that success and saying it's intrinsically valuable to your self-worth, but rather you now have agency to decide, well, maybe this is the work that I'm doing, maybe I don't like it, but at the same time, it doesn't say anything about my personhood, and that I think is an important distinction to hear from the sound. Let's come to some rebuttal. First, to tell you this idea about individual happiness and how people are getting it. We understand that happiness is something that that people get. However, we also think that once you defeat that narrative, you're not exactly taking away that happiness. But two, I think there's a very important distinction, right? So for example, for working class individuals, what does this happiness look like? For example, when you get a promotion, does it look like you get a better paying job so you can afford healthcare for your kids? Is that really happiness or is that relief? We think that if that's the kind of happiness you want to value and ascribe individual value to, I think that's harmful, right? Because at the end of the day, you're thinking that while you get away with getting such a bigger thing, but as a society as a whole, you're not progressing. So we think it doesn't really matter. Two, they talk to you about this idea of the gender wage gap and how, because women fight for it, it somehow shows to you that it has intrinsic value. I think this is completely outside the scope of this debate, right? Because that's just a principle of equity. If men are getting paid for the same amount of labor is something that's extrinsic to you, something that you're putting outside of your own personhood, and you're not getting compensated for it. We think that that's striving for equity exists in the counterfactual as well. But lastly, they talked to us about this idea about replacement and how it's going to take away different forms. I think that this is a weak argument, right? Why? Because I think while if some people want to choose and preface their romantic relationships over it, so be it. What we're telling you is that we're liberating people to the extent where there's no central narrative dictating what should value to you. So you as a person have more agency to choose whether or not you want to put more effort into your relationship. Maybe you want to write a novel, but you are not a career novelist, but that's a personal hobby that you want to pursue that gives you happiness, that makes you more creative, go be it. That's the side that we're taking as government. The rest of my rebuttal will, I think I'll mostly be able to get it in my positive case as well. But I really want to clarify this idea of why specifically, even aside from capitalism, this value ascribing process is always going to be hierarchical. When you attach value to something, it's automatically like saying there's a quantification of it. So forget even comparing yourself to other people, even within your own life, when you ascribe value to certain career achievements, you're going to even be competing against yourself and seeing, well, is this promotion better than the other? We think that at the end of the day, when you're ascribing this form of value and it becomes quantified, you're almost always going to give more credence to higher paying jobs. Because let's be real, when you talk about career processes and like career paths that you're taking, these promotions and, for example, climbing up the ladder only looks like in a bigger company. When you're working sanitation jobs, most of the people are working the exact same jobs. There's very little mobility within them. So where does your value for measuring your career success even come from, right? But to even engaging with them at their best case scenario when they bring about this idea about NGOs and whatnot, right? I think that's still problematic because like if you think about the philanthropy space, right? So for example, Jane Goodall, who's oftenly like venerated as being a famous conservationist, we think that that's problematic because when she weighs out her achievements and successes, it completely leaves out the fact that what privileges she had to get there, whether or not her success exactly has intrinsic value or maybe because it was off the birth lottery. And that's something that I want to go in deeper, right? So let's talk about this idea of when you assume that all of your successes are based upon meritocratic principles. We think the meritocracy within a capitalist world will always be a myth. What happens when you ascribe value to it, or the narrative does? It shows you that while you have had a success in your career path and you deserve it and only you deserve it, which is why you've gotten it. We think that this is particularly harmful, one, because it is untruthful. For example, a person who is born in a richer family maybe is able to have the right connections, networking with someone, went to an Ivy League school and is able to land a big fancy consulting job and is making $200K right out of college. That would be a success, would have intrinsic value, but as society writ large, is that person really going to think about what opportunities they had? No. But I think on a second level, it's harmful towards how they engage with the outside world, right? Because they're going to say that while I worked so hard and I got this this promotion or this particular job, and that makes me a better person than you are because I'm such a hard worker. We think that when you dismantle or decouple this idea of having intrinsic value with your career path, then you realize that maybe all these things are arbitrary, right? Because they are. They don't have any form of value towards themselves, but maybe outside, yeah, this job gives me a lot of money, and money is extrinsic. It's not an intrinsic value that this thing can have. So we think why this is extremely harmful is because it leads to this social stratification within society, right? We see that when value is distributed heavily towards like upper class jobs, we think that you view working class jobs as lesser than you because you think you're better than them for what you have done. But lastly, I want to talk to you about this idea specifically within women and people of color and how this narrative uniquely harms them. It's interesting that they brought up the gender wage gap because I think that oftentimes for women liberation or liberation of minorities, we often talk to it about as if what society now calls is like boss girl feminism, where you as women need to be overworking yourself, take every single opportunity because men take it. And this is uniquely at the harm of women, right? Because you're overworking you, but as if you have a point to prove to society. You have to redeem your entire gender. Same goes for people of minority groups, for example, African American communities or Latina communities, to show that while we are here and we're like to fight against any myths that they have. So for example, if women are shown as, oh, they have to go home and take care of your kids, now you have a point to prove that, oh, I am going to bring my newborn baby to the California house floor and show that I can do both. We think that this is uniquely harmful because when you put so much value towards your career, you're not given the space to kind of step away with it and think what matters to you outside of it. It all becomes out of most of your value coming in from your career path and what is getting from that. For all those reasons, because disproving capitalism was never the point of this debate, we're proud to propose.
I thank that member for their remarks, and I invite the member of opposition to open up closing opposition. Here.
Cool. Can everyone hear me all right?
Yes, you're audible.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. 3 things in the speech. Firstly, some responses to the government bench. Secondly, some framing about what we think this debate looks like, specifically from CO, and then an extension argument from closing opposition. Firstly, let's get into some quick responses just to government bench in whole, but specifically closing governments. What you get from closing governments is explanations as to why meritocratic success in and of itself is a bad measure to attribute value to. Okay, fair. And we agree with that, right? We think instead success can be framed as just doing day-to-day things as well, right? Closing government doesn't give me any reason to believe as to why only meritocratic success like raises and promotions are the things that can be considered successes. I think doing your day-to-day job to a good extent is probably a success in my book, and I think that realistically people can see that as a success to themselves, right? Just because you don't get promotions every month doesn't mean that you are a failure of a worker, and I think that's just a bad way to look at people by and large, right? So it's unclear to me why success has to be advancements necessarily, right? But also we want to point out is that people on both sides of the house might still look down on poor people just because like they're poor, right? But we think that at the very least on our side, you're able to make poor people feel better about themselves through the work that they have to do, right? So very simply, it's just like a fast food worker can derive some sense of enjoyment from being able to make a really good burger that a customer really enjoyed for lunch, right? I think that just feeling some satisfaction in that is probably a good and can be and should have some value attributed to it in and of itself. Firstly, let's get into framing and just like what this debate looks like. Firstly, and I think CG correctly points this out, of that like huge ass impacts of this round are just things that cannot really be considered. And I think opening half talks about these far-fetched impacts too much, right? What I think this impact is about is just talking about who is able to make working class people and poor people who work as well just happier in their day-to-day lives, right? It's not about ripping down systems that actually extend past narratives that we're talking about in this debate, right? That link is very unclear to me and remains unclear to me through the opening half, right? But secondly, just 2 things talking about value and success, right? Value isn't necessarily just about like how you individually view it, right? What CEO wants to bring you uniquely is that value can also just be, intrinsic value to the community, right? Like what do you do for others on a day-to-day basis? And just framing the work that you do in that way of talking about, okay, maybe you yourself didn't like sell so many like software things or sell a lot of like sofas or something, right? But you probably found someone their dream sofa and did a success and that is a success to someone, and that's something that you should have value on, right? The second thing is just success, right? And like I said in like refutation, it doesn't necessarily have to be meritocratic achievements or promotions. It can be just doing things on a day-to-day that are able to help people. with that, let's get into extension. Firstly, just talking about how this combats neoliberal ideas that thrive under capitalism that have ultimately been hurting workers in their like personal lives, right? Let's do some framing firstly. Neoliberal ideas and what they are, just firstly, are reinforced by laws and practices, right? So we want to point out is that it is unlikely for you to scrap down all of neoliberalism, but rather what we're able to do on CO through this narrative is that you're able to at least make people feel better while living under this system, as we acknowledge that tearing it down is unlikely because it extends throughout narratives into like manifestation and the material laws and other practices by corporations and stuff like that. It is very hard to take that down through one little narrative in this case. But what we're able to do is make people feel better about themselves and at the very least get them to be happier on net, which we think is a benefit that you can claim for a lot of people, and just it adds up, right? So what we think these ideals are and how they've been harmful to people is just like, firstly, competitive nature and things like that, right? So within capitalist society, just because of things like hyper specialization of labor, you're able to separate workers and force them to compete against one another, seeing themselves as rivals or people who shouldn't care about others rather than just viewing yourself as an individual. The second reason is through hyper specialization of labor, where you don't have to interact with other people, where you can just do one very specific job and not be concerned about anyone else in that whole company in and of itself, right? And you don't actually see the full fruits of your labor through your eyes because you're not able to see, like, maybe you assemble a sofa as a sofa. You don't see that sofa being sold to someone and how it goes to their house and how they feel good about something, right? Maybe you're just the person that flips the patty or puts the bun on the patty, right? You don't see a person eating that burger and actually deriving enjoyment from it, right? We think, and thirdly is that like the need for like bills and paying shit also forces you to work for your life, and rather instead of like pursuing things like hobbies or even like volunteer work and the charity work that people derive enjoyments from, aren't able to do this anymore because of the fact that, you know, they have to work, right? So what this has led to is things like isolation, feelings of having no self-worth and that you don't matter within like the world at large. You're not contributing anything to the world, that you are so minuscule, you're an atom out of like anything, right? And this leads to is mental health issues, also just feelings of insecurity and having no self-worth. What we think is that these values further isolation. What changes on our side is a few things. One is that this narrative doesn't just show you that you're happy with yourself, right? And that like you can find some enjoyment from like, you know, sewing a sofa, right? But we tell you that your job is able to hold significance for other people that you might not see on a day-to-day basis, but rather actually derive enjoyment and might have like life-changing experiences with as a result of the labor that you have put in from your job, right? We think, and also things that like you serve a big part in the community, right? So for example, if you're like a veterinarian, right, telling someone that their, you know, best friend dog is in a perfectly healthy condition, that's something that is your day-to-day job. But if you do that, it makes people feel better about themselves and gives them like, you know, a lot of enjoyment and also just like comfort, right? Recognizing the fact that each individual worker has the opportunity to make that impact onto the community, and recognizing that they do make that impact is something that is in and of itself an important thing that we should put value on, right? But also is that we're able to like incentivize people to work hard and actually do well to fulfill their role, right? I think there are lots of people in the world who actually enjoy working at their job, but are unable to, feel unsatisfied with it because they don't feel that they're making an impact on the world or to other people, right? So I think in that case, we're able to bridge the gap between these things where people can understand that they actually do have impacts onto other people, and at the very least that they're actually achieving that impact while still being able to pursue the work that they're doing, and also just be more productive, which I think people generally enjoy. Like people, I guess, enjoy doing work to a degree, and they're down with doing those things, right? So I think in that case, you're able to have more motivated individuals to do work that hopefully they can find some enjoyment of it, right? But the last thing is just like, also, I think this just means that people are happier in their day-to-day lives, excluding work, right? So that they're able, like, apart from work, right? So that they're able to be like, if they're happy in work, they derive fulfillment from being in work and personal fulfillment, they're probably able to be happy with like their family and other people, right? I think that it's very hard for individuals to just be happy with yourself and happy in your day-to-day life if you feel like shit working a job for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, in which you feel that you're doing nothing productive and not contributing to the world. At that point, I think it is very hard for individuals to derive any sort of fulfillment and self-enjoyment. And at that point, this is when you lead to things like isolation and things like that. For all these reasons, we're incredibly proud to oppose.
I thank that member for their remarks, and I invite the Gov Whip to close off the Gov half of today's debate. Hear, hear.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
burden on opposition side in this debate was to prove to us not create new value systems, but to prove to us that existing value-based systems that society has created, that society has told you matter within the current narrative of what intrinsic value looks like, allow people to enjoy these things, as CEO says, on a day-to-day basis and consider them as successes. We don't think that they've done that. Second, on this notion of capitalism, this is again something my partner pointed out, but our burden in this debate was never to prove to you how we're going to solve capitalism, but how we're simply reducing one of the factors that adds to it and in fact perpetuates the narrative of capitalism and allows and decreases rights for working class people. Coming to my crystallizing questions in this debate. One, the value of careers versus the intrinsic value of careers on a philosophical level. And second, I'm going to talk about this idea of like how this is impacted out into working class communities. Firstly, let's talk about this debate on how it was perceived and mischaracterized through the opening half and even by closing opposition to a certain extent. We think that this debate is not about whether your value should come from your career or not, whether it should come from your romantic relation, or whether it should come from your family. We think that this debate is about whether or not the value that does come from your career is intrinsic to your career or not. We don't think that opposition has provided enough groundwork for why this valuation that comes from your career is so intrinsically valuable, but it's in fact based on societal valuations that they completely ignored in this debate. Second, we saw this point coming out of opening opposition where they said people have different types of jobs, which is why, and this is exactly where we agree. CEOs are not the only people who have jobs, and like monetary compensation is not the only form of value within society. But when they talk about doctors, lawyers, when they talk about things like people who participate in NGOs, they do two things. One, they quantify these jobs. They say a doctor and a person who works at an NGO is better than a doctor, who is better than a CEO, who is better than a sanitation worker. Why? Because his job doesn't have any value. But second, the problem with this argument is that they essentially do to take away from this notion of intrinsic valuation. We think intrinsic value is something that has intrinsic value is something that doesn't have value associated from society onto it. We think society, in the case of doctors, lawyers, and NGO workers, tells you that if you are helping people, you are doing something good. We think that opposition in this case refuses to acknowledge the fact that all of these values coming in are coming from societal based expectations and not individual value that comes from just working in an NGO. Second, this idea of what kind of success is even intrinsically valuable. We think that they create this distinction, which is based not on the specific narrative of this debate, but on this narrative that they're trying to create. But before I move on, what is something that is even intrinsically valuable? We think that this happens on three levels. This is again something Shanzi talked about. One, we think this happens when your product is successful. We think that there's loads of careers, like for example, recreational sports, where your product is going to be successful, but should we not award value to them simply because a product is not something that is successful? Secondly, your process is successful. We think, again, this is something Shanzi talked about. There's no meritocracy within society. So if there's no meritocracy, how can we even award anything intrinsic value to these things? But lastly, how difficult your work was. We think that the difficulty of work is inherently arbitrary, which means that even if you are able to award like difficulty of how certain jobs or how difficult certain jobs are or may be, we think that because that's arbitrary, that's not intrinsic value, but societal based value. But second, this idea of happiness, and especially broad happiness. We think one, happiness doesn't just exist in the capitalistic nature of that this debate is occurring in. We think it's not happiness that allows people to be doing these things. It's not happiness that allows people to feel intrinsic value, but instead it's relief that they are not going to be evicted. It's relief that they're going to be able to live in the same place for another month, which we don't think is intrinsic value in and of itself. But second, we also think that who told you that happiness is something that has intrinsic value? Who told you that being happy is something good? We think that these are notions that come from society and are not intrinsically valuable to your career. Thirdly, the idea of broad happiness. We think broad happiness, which means happiness for all people within society, especially within the capitalist system, cannot exist specifically because happiness within this system is about individual careers. The reason that Jeff Bezos is rich is because he doesn't pay his workers enough money, is because he treats them, has poor working conditions for them, and is because there's not enough taxation on him, which means that in order for you to succeed in a capitalist system, you must step on someone else's neck, which is why this idea of broad happiness that comes out of opposition is completely taken down, because we don't think every single person can be happy. Then I'm going to come to my second crystallizing question. Before that, I'll take a point from opening opposition.
Sure, I'm a little confused. You tell me that intrinsic value is dependent on what society assigns value to, but at the same time, you're saying that external successes are not intrinsic value because patient outcomes don't count. That confuses me.
Exactly what we're saying. We're saying that intrinsic value is something that should be intrinsic, not assigned by society, which is something that opposition in this debate continues to ignore. The fact that all these values of happiness, or people working within NGOs, or people working as doctors or lawyers, even the successes or the values that come from those people, who told them that those are things that are meant to have value? It was society. It was not intrinsic to their career. But coming to the second crystallizing question, one, I'm going to talk about this idea of day-to-day happiness and productivity, and what that even looks like. Again, we think that productivity is not a measure for success, is not a measure for intrinsic valuation. But second, we think that this idea of day-to-day success, and when, especially in closing opposition comes up and says that someone who just did a good job at work one day should be able to feel happy, we think that would be great. But unfortunately, currently within the societal narrative that we live in, those people are not going to feel happy. Those people are going to feel depressed because they're underpaid. They don't have the resources that they need to be living like a normal standard of living, which is why they're not going to be happy and they're not going to be productive, which takes down this idea, this entire notion of like neoliberal ideas and the competitive nature and hyper specialization, all of that. But lastly, this idea that was completely refuted by closing opposition, or entire extension, about women and minorities. We think that when you expect certain sections of society to work harder in order to gain the same rights, you exclude society from the intrinsic value of any achievements. But secondly, you also perpetuate a hierarchy of whose work matters more, on not just on a career-based level, but also on a gender and race-based level, which we think is inherently problematic. What have we shown to you in this debate today? We've shown to you a couple of things. We've shown to you that there's no such thing as intrinsic value when it comes to careers and success. We think every single valuation that value mechanisms that opposition has provided in this debate come not from the intrinsic nature of the work that these people are doing, but instead come from society in and of itself. But lastly, we think that you do not provide happiness. Happiness is also not an intrinsic value, by the way, for the broad spectrum of society and harm women and minorities, which is why we take the debate.
Hi, I'm just confirming that everybody can hear me.
Yeah, I can hear you. I thank that member for their speech, and I invite the op whip to close out the debate today. Here.
Sorry for interrupting you. My computer sometimes, like, the mic gets weird, so I just didn't want to delay the round further. Sorry about that.
No, you're fine.
So last winter, I was coming home from a debating tournament, don't remember which one, and as I was driving into my driveway, my back left tire, I think it was, or front left, one of the two, exploded, completely popped. So I was going to a tournament the next weekend because I'm an addict, and I called the local tow truck driver. Guy comes over, helps me fix the tire. And nicest guy I've ever met. He was talking to me about how he had recently won an award for being the #1 tow truck driver in the small community of London, Ontario that he services. He showed me pictures of him with his wife celebrating this award. You could tell that he was clearly proud of it. And the reason for that is because it was clear the amount of dedication and effort and the long hours that he puts into his work on a day-to-day basis. Whether or not he chooses this job consensually or it was the only option available to him that allows him to feed his family, the reality is that this is a person who got success within their career, very marginal amounts. I mean, it is still a tow truck driver, the kind of industry that government bench would say that would never benefit from this. But what we tell you in opposition, which notably gets zero response, literally our whole case gets zero responses out of the closing government, is that when people are working 8 hours a day, 40 hours a week, in many cases now under neoliberalism, 60, 70, 80 hours a week, and people get no recognition for the care and labor that they are putting in, not only for their own interest, but for the interest of the community writ large, it makes them materially better off when they view their own work as something that is valuable in and of itself, because it allows them to make connections with people in their community that they have never met. It allows them to be happier people when they engage with their family, because they didn't spend 8 to 10 hours that day feeling fucking depressed and wanting to kill themselves, but instead they felt that what they were doing was valuable. And that was the question that government needed to address. So the first thing I want to deal with in this speech is this idea of what the narrative looks like, right? Because government bent wants to push this idea that this is about society enforcing a hierarchy of what labor is valuable, right? And the analysis here makes sense. They're saying that it's like based on wage, it's based on prestige, it's based on social power. But that's not this debate, right? Because what does like there are other areas where people feel intrinsic value, right? Like their family, their hobbies, things to this effect. But society doesn't necessarily create a strict hierarchy of what family goals are necessarily important, or of which hobby achievements are necessarily important, right? Which card in my deck of hockey cards I most recently have is not necessarily something that fits within a social stratosphere of what is considered important, yet it can still have intrinsic value to the individual who partakes within that hobby. So I also say that different people have different conceptions of what success within their job is, even if they're in the same job. I work teaching small children debating. Many people in debating work teaching small children debating. I personally find value and success from making sure that children have a fun time doing debating with zero care for how they do at a tournament. Plenty of other instructors find value from how it is that their children perform at an individual tournament, suggesting that the narrative that we get from Gov is very unnuanced if they want to say that everybody, even if they are in a specific type of job field, views their own job in the same way and views the importance of their job similarly, suggesting that our analysis that Zach gives 5 distinct mechanisms for, the fact that there are lots of bills, the fact that you have one individual hyper-specialized job, the fact that you view your other coworkers as competition that you need to be able to go against on a day-to-day basis, the fact that you have to, that you are so separated from what the actual end outcome of your own labor is that you don't even see its consequence. And one more that I didn't write down, but I know it's there, right? Suggest that this is about your own internalization of what it is you view the value of your job to be, because classism is still going to exist, right? Like, it's a narrative that rich CEOs create in order to justify not paying a vast majority of essential workers. I assure you that without this narrative, classism is still going to exist and be normalized, right? Because there's also issues like barriers to be able to get into the high-level jobs and about whether or not GDP matters. Like, there's lots of reasons why this is going to be the case. So this is about the internal perception that you have as an individual. I think that this was very clear from the get-go of this round. So what's the consequence of this, that this ends up happening, right? So government bench wants to talk about whether or not you can then use the elimination of this narrative to then improve the material conditions for the working class. 3 notes on this. The first is, I think that they overextend their impact a bit too much, right? So when you get analysis about like how this works to decentralize sexism as a part of our own working nature, I mean, I guess that would be really good. But the fact is that like, whether or not you view work as intrinsically valuable doesn't change the fact that like on their world where we don't view success as work as intrinsically valuable means that like specifically gendered and feminized work now is seen as unvaluable on the whole and gets zero respect and appreciation, right? I don't know to what level you get that kind of systemic change, especially in comparison to the atomization and individualization, which we characterize to you being the status quo. When you don't have to care about other people, you especially don't have to care about their enfranchisement in the economic system. Opening.
Your extension is contingent on average daily work being considered successful and career achievements in the vast majority of cases. This is not the workplace culture that exists in most working class jobs. They actually demonize people who just do their job and devalue it. Like, your impact of happiness doesn't actually accrue in the vast majority of cases. Please engage.
Zach and I think, have been obscenely clear about this. Like, I actually think this is the clearest thing we said, is that this creates the opportunity for people to put more care and delicacy into their own work, right? Having a tailor who like is happy about the fact that the suit that they just made might make their client feel really happy when they go to their wedding is something that like you can take pride in, right? Regardless of whether or not you're just showing up to do your job. We're saying that this allows you to feel better about doing your job, right? It allows you to feel that your job has value outside of what you're doing because you're helping other people. And in turn, you do more than just the barest minimum, which government would say means that you only help your exploiter because you're putting in more hours. But I don't think that this correlates heavily with a giant increase in like toxic bro work culture. Instead, I think that this is the basis of solidarity, right? Like, one, read Marx, the whole point of this is that you should feel more connected to your own labor, and that's the byproduct of creating a healthy society. But the real analysis here is that when you feel a part of a society and feel contributing a part of it, it's when you care about their own material interests, because you feel to some attachment close to them, that you don't only act and vote and do direct action in the most selfish way possible, because you feel attached to them at some level. And I think that's preferable. We're proud to oppose.
I thank that member for their remarks, and I thank everyone for a great debate. If you could exit this Zoom call, obviously this is an out round, so there will be no OA. Feel free to reach out to myself or my panel.